As we continue our study of the isms, the ideologies or the foundational philosophies that impact the culture in which we live, I want to turn our attention now to hedonism. Again, we have a case that we use a word to describe a movement or a philosophy that not everybody in the culture is aware of. I'm sure that there are vast numbers of people in America who have never heard the word hedonism, but I can't conceive of anybody of age in America who has not experienced the impact or the import of hedonism as a life and worldview. Hedonism as a philosophy has this basic principle for its foundation, which is hedonism defines the good or the true in terms of pleasure and pain. That is the summum bonum, the highest good of man. The ultimate purpose for his being is found in the enjoyment of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And so what the hedonist is searching for constantly and continuously is an increase in pleasure and a decrease in pain. Now, I want to just make a tiny little distinction here. The true hedonist seeks not so much for the maximum of pleasure as he seeks for the optimum of pleasure, that which will be the most pleasurable, all things being equal. Well, historically, we see the rise of hedonism not as a new thing springing onto the 20th century culture into the vacuum of the absence of the transcendent, which we've discussed. But hedonism has its roots very, very early in the world. I mean, we could trace it to the Garden of Eden if we had to, but in terms of a formal philosophy, we find it back in the ancient Greek culture in the school of the Cyrenaics. Now, the Cyrenaics were what I would call crass hedonists. Crass or crude hedonists. Now, you may have never heard of the Cyrenaics, but you have seen visual images of their philosophy of life manifested many, many times through Hollywood productions and through TV dramas and so on. You've seen the pictures of the ancient Roman orgies, where people are just indulging themselves without restraint in reckless abandon in wine, women, and song, right? I think of Fellini's Satyricon as perhaps the most vivid portrayal of that kind of a lifestyle that Hollywood has ever produced. Or we think of the ancient Bacchanalia. Have you ever heard of the old Bacchanalia, which was the festival of the celebration of what god? Do you remember? God Bacchus, who was the god of the vine, the god of grapes, the god of wine. And the Bacchanalia was this wild, orgiastic celebration done in honor of the god Bacchus. We also think of the way in which hedonism became not only a philosophy in parts of the ancient world, but actually a religion. Have you heard of the Dionysian style of the orgy? The Dionysian frenzy, where the god Dionysius, or Dionysius, was worshipped. He was the counterpart to Bacchus. He was worshipped as the one who would give us an ability to break out of the chains that inhibit us in terms of our normal states of consciousness and awareness. I mean, the Greek philosophers understood that there were limits to what we were able to know through empirical perception, through the use of our five senses. And there was a limit to the knowledge that we could reach by speculation on the basis of reason. And so some sought a release from the prison house of the normal restraints of human knowledge that could come through some kind of intuition or mystical experience. And so there were those who made a religion out of worshiping the God that they thought would give them the ability to transcend the normal limits of consciousness. And that was the god Dionysius, who provided the means of drunken stupor, wherein one state of drunkenness, the normal inhibitions of our wakeful life are removed. And people believed that they, through the drunken stupor, could make contact with the supernatural world in a mystical experience of getting high, if you will. The experience was not called getting low. It was getting high, breaking through the limits and the structures of normal consciousness. And this was added into all kinds of sexual involvement and even temple prostitution, where the prostitutes were there presumably to help a person break down their inhibitions so that they could make contact with the gods and experience the feeling of ecstasy, which was the release of the soul that was understood really physically or sensuously. Now, as I say, it's the Cyrenaics who adopted this crass form of radical indulgence in drunkenness and sex and all of that sort of thing. And oftentimes we think falsely of the radical hedonists as being the Epicureans. But the Epicureans were the next stage. The Epicureans were much more sophisticated advocates of hedonism. In fact, today we will often use the term Epicurean to define what kind of person? A person with exquisite taste. A person who can identify the finest wines, but who is not himself a drunkard. The person who has a gourmet palate and understands the intricacies of the culinary arts. We call him an Epicurean. A person who understands the finest clothes and the finest rugs and that, who appreciates the finer things of life, is often called an Epicurean. But he is also a person who is devoted to his his creature comforts, isn't he? He lives for the enjoyment of a very sophisticated level of pleasure. Now, the Epicureans adopted a more moderate, or what I call refined variety of hedonism, because they learned very early the problem of Cyrenaic hedonism, the problem of all hedonism, the problem of what is called the hedonistic paradox. How many of you have ever heard of the hedonistic paradox? The hedonistic paradox is this. The problem the devotee of hedonism encounters is this. What happens if he fails to achieve the measure of pleasure that he seeks? What happens? What intrudes into his life? Frustration. Is frustration painful or pleasant? It's painful. So if you don't get the pleasure you're seeking, you experience frustration, and there's a sense in which the more that you seek the pleasure and more you fail to achieve it, the more pain that intrudes into your life because of your frustration. But what happens if you achieve it? If you achieve it for too long, you become sated, you become bored. And boredom, which is the counterpart of frustration, is also painful to the pleasure seeker. And so the hedonistic paradox was, if you achieve what you want, you lose. If you don't achieve what you're searching for, you lose. And also, the Epicureans understood the price tag for pleasure. They understood that if you overindulge, like we have a sign down in this dining room, those who overindulge, what? Bulge. You know, second on the lips, lifetime on the hips. That's part of the hedonistic paradox. The momentary enjoyment of pleasure can have consequences that are painful. And the Epicureans understood that, and they said if you indulged in too much wine, then the end result would not be this exquisite enjoyment of fine-tasting wine, but it would be the awful hangover of the next day. If you overindulged in sexual activities, you were increasing your odds for future misery in terms of venereal disease or whatever, and so on. And so they tried to create a more balanced enjoyment of pleasure and pain. Just a little bit of adultery, you know, just a little bit. Just enough to spice up life, to keep the excitement flowing in the human heart. Now, in addition, the Epicureans were seeking for the same thing that the Stoics were seeking for, but they were seeking it in a completely different manner. The ultimate goal of Epicurean philosophy was the achievement of what was called philosophical ataraxia. Philosophical ataraxia. How many have ever heard of that word? Has anybody in this room ever heard that word? Somewhere in a lecture. I know you've heard it before. Some of you who are doctors' wives perhaps should have heard of it. Ataraxia today, the only time you hear this word in our culture today is it's a brand name for a tranquilizer. Okay? And the quest for philosophical ataraxia among the ancient Epicureans and the Stoics was simply the quest for peace of mind. The search for peace of mind. Now, is that something unique to the Epicurean? Doesn't everybody want peace of mind? Sure. The Stoics felt that the only way to find peace of mind was by adopting a philosophy of what they called imperturbability. Don't let anything get to you. You know, you adopt a stoical attitude to all things. Don't get emotionally involved. Don't get your hopes up. Don't get your hopes down. But maintain an emotional state of equilibrium where nothing phases you. You don't, you adopt a detached type of feeling towards things over which you have no control. In fact, it was based on a very deterministic understanding of the world, that all things happen by fixed mechanical causes, according to the Stoics, and we can't change things. Que sera, sera was originally the song of the Stoics. All right? And they said, the only thing that I have control over in my life is not what happens to me. If I'm going to get hit by a car this afternoon, I can't help that. The only thing I really have control over is how I react to it inwardly. And so the Stoics sought to master the ability of being cool. I'm not letting anything shake you up inwardly. That was their approach. The Epicureans approached it the other way, through an active pursuit of, they believed that you could change the state of affairs and the events that affect you in your life. And that happens primarily through an active pursuit of pleasure and an active avoidance in pain. Now, there are very few people in our culture who will call themselves hedonists, who will come right out and say, that's my philosophy of life. I live for pleasure and for the avoidance of pain. Hugh Hefner might attach his name to a philosophy like that, but most of us, even in a secular environment, still have negative value judgments about that kind of view of reality. Yet at the same time, we all recognize that there is a little bit of the hedonist in all of us. Even the masochist is a hedonist. He's a reverse hedonist. He seeks to maximize pain, but not so that he can avoid pleasure, but what? so he can gain it. He just has a sort of a short circuit in terms of pain and pleasure, but he's still seeking pleasure. Now, who does not want to have experiences that are pleasant? And who really wants to enjoy pain? I sure don't. I want pleasure, and I want to avoid pain, and I want comfort, and I want to be able to have a full stomach at the end of the night. I want to feel good. I don't want to feel bad. Is there anybody who's different from that? There's a sense in which what hedonism does is capitalizes on a certain built-in given to human nature, something which is universal. I mean, we are creatures of sensation. We have feelings. We can experience pain and we don't like it. We can experience pleasure and we do like it. But what the hedonist does is he puts that suffix on the end, ISM, and turns it into a philosophy of ultimates, an ultimate standpoint of value, so that truth and goodness are determined in the final analysis by this calculus of pain and pleasure. Christianity tells us going in that if we embrace certain values, there will be pain in it. Christ was not a hedonist when he went up to Jerusalem. He had a duty to perform which was good and which was true, but which was painful. The hedonists would declare Christ a fool, forever voluntarily accepting that kind of pain unnecessarily. Hedonism is hardly altruistic. And yet Christianity calls us not to seek suffering, not to seek pain, or to flee from that which is pleasant, and there's no sin in enjoying the pleasant and enjoying the freedom from pain, but there are times when the Christian must choose the road that inevitably leads to pain. And so we do not establish hedonism as the summum bonum, the highest good. We believe that the highest good will ultimately bring us the maximum pleasure and the minimum pain, because from a Christian perspective, the maximal location of pain is in the pit of hell, and the optimum abode of pleasure is in the kingdom of God. But pleasure is defined differently from what it is in hedonism. Hedonism tends to see that pleasure strictly in sensual feeling levels, physical, quantified dimensions. Now, let's look for a moment at modern forms of hedonism. We have seen in our own generation extreme forms of escapism manifested in our own contemporary culture. There seems to be a strong quest, not for or pursuit of happiness, but the pursuit of happiness has been translated by the new generation into the pursuit of euphoria. That happiness has been translated almost exclusively into the category of feeling. I'm sure you've already noticed this, but just sometimes, like when you hear a new word, this is not a new word, but when you hear a new word, for the first time, suddenly you hear it 5 times that week, you become aware of it. What I'd like you to do is pay attention when you see this word or hear this word in your culture. See how the word feeling functions in your culture. This term, this concept, is so pervasive in our society that standard traditional forms of language, standard traditional categorical propositions and prefatory statements about theoretical thought have changed to accommodate this word. What I'm saying is a lot of big words here, very simply, is I read students' papers all the time. It drives me nuts. I get, where my hand at, using the red pencil when they keep saying, when they're presenting a case in the paper, I feel that we should do this. I feel that Descartes is wrong. Or I feel that Kant has made a mistake here. Do you see that in your students? I feel. And I circle it all. I say, what do you mean you feel that Descartes made a mistake? Don't tell me you feel that Descartes made a mistake. What you mean is you think that Descartes makes a mistake. You're thinking of a cognitive process here. It's not a feeling. It's thinking. And I want to see the substance of your thought on your paper. I don't want to have you bleeding all over the paper in terms of your feelings. The exploration of feelings is a very appropriate science for the physician or even for the psychologist. When somebody comes into me for counseling, I know that feelings are important enough that I don't say to that husband, what do you think of your wife? I'm asking the feeling questions because I know they're the loaded ones. That's where the emotion is. And I'll say, how do you feel about when she does this or that? How do you feel when he does that or that? I'm trying to get at the feelings because I don't want to deny for a moment that feelings are a very, very vital part of what it means to be human. But they're not the same thing as thinking. But the feeling has become so exaggerated in our culture that even in our speech patterns, we're talking about feeling ideas. Feeling thoughts instead of thinking thoughts and thinking ideas. We've seen the explosion of a relatively new science, the science of psychology, in terms of its public involvement. That we're a nation preoccupied with the analysis of our moods, which is again a focus on our feelings. Other things, of course, are much more obvious. We see the explosion of the use of artificial forms to induce euphoria. Drugs. This is the drug culture today. Think of the cocaine industry in this nation, the marijuana industry, or the rapidly rising rate of teenage alcoholism, which was featured in local television programs recently called The Chemical People. I remember in 1963, when I was working at St. Francis Hospital in Pittsburgh, a Cadillac limousine drove up in front of that hospital, and a girl was escorted out of that Cadillac and brought into the psychiatric ward of the hospital and admitted to the alcoholic ward. She was 15 years old. And I remember the buzz that went through the hospital at that time. It was scandalous that there was such a thing as a 15-year-old alcoholic in 1963. Today, there are literally millions of hardcore teenage alcoholics in our culture because of the impact of a philosophy of radical and crass hedonism. That life is to be lived to escape pain and responsibility, anything that's uncomfortable, anything that's unpleasing. As I was reading again in a woman who was teaching literature saying that the school board demands that they choose books that the teenagers will enjoy while they're teaching them literature. Nobody's saying that they have to enjoy the study of mathematics, but they must enjoy the books that are selected. And so instead of teaching children great literature, the literature courses become hours of entertainment so that the kids can feel good. I mean, it's controlling the environment. Just in a couple minutes I have left, let me just point out some things. Hedonism, by saying that the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of pleasure is a good, is making a value judgment. And it produces, at the same time, a system of ethics, which in turn produces a behavioral pattern of morality. What are some of the popular axioms or maxims of current-day hedonism? You've heard this one a jillion times. If it feels good, it what? It is good. If it feels good, it is good. Their goodness, the good, is determined by what? Feeling. Feeling. Huh? Look at the music, look at the novel, listen. I mean, even, not too long ago, we saw the introduction to the world of music of a Christian girl who went to the very top of the charts with the song that was the song of the year in America a couple of years ago. The daughter of Pat Boone. Debbie Boone sings, "You Light Up My Life," which was supposed to symbolize the power of Christ to illumine and enlighten a person living in darkness. Do you remember the lyrics? How can it be wrong if it feels so good? It's supposed to be a Christian song. How can it be wrong if it feels so good? That is the hedonist ethic, not the Christian ethic. Again, I only have seconds left, and so I will just give a quote that I heard last week from Helen Gurley Brown to indicate how much the society has changed with respect to its values with vis-a-vis hedonism. She has given to us a new definition of promiscuity. When I was in high school, the word promiscuity meant having sexual relationships with more than one person outside of marriage. That was the given definition of promiscuity. The new definition by Helen Gurley Brown of promiscuity is having sexual relationships with more than one person in the same day. In the same day. See? That's the new definition of promiscuity. Again, the whole sex ethic, the whole sexual revolution that the nation has gone through does not happen in a vacuum. There are cultural and philosophical and ethical reasons for these changes that take place. And when the transcendent is removed and any ultimate basis of truth and goodness is destroyed, what are you left with? But your feelings.